Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's event. I'm so pleased to welcome you to what's going to be a fantastic conversation between two excellent collaborators. My name's Abigail Brundin. I am the very newly inaugurated director of the British School at Rome. The British School at Rome is really pleased to be collaborating with the British Museum as part of the major exhibition, Nero, the Man Behind the Myth. So we're celebrating that exhibition tonight in our conversation, and we're also celebrating the publication, I think official publication date, 28th of September, of Mary Beard's new book, 12 Caesars, Images of Power from the Ancient World to the Modern, coming out with Princeton University Press, and details will be circulated. For anyone unfamiliar with the British School at Rome, a moment's plug, we are the UK's largest research institution located inside the European Union, a centre for interdisciplinary research excellence. For fine art practice, we support the full range of arts, humanities and social sciences. Both of our speakers this evening have long and deep connections to the British School at Rome. Mary Beard is a very long time friend of the BSR, a connection which, as she told us in a recent column in the TLS, began during 4 months she spent in Rome as part of her PhD, and where she told us in that piece, she really started her research career. So I would like to claim that for the BSR tonight. Mary Beard needs little introduction, but it's worth mentioning that she is a trustee of the British Museum, so a strong connection with our other collaborator this evening. She's a professor of classics at the University of Cambridge and a fellow of Newnham College, and also professor of ancient literature at the Royal Academy. And our second speaker, Andrew Wallace-Hadrill. Andrew was director of the British School at Rome and my a distinguished predecessor between the years 1995 and 2009. He oversaw a huge amount of activity at British School, including a major building programme, which left us with a fabulous lecture theatre and exhibition space. Andrew was awarded an OBE in 2002 for services to Anglo-Italian cultural relations, and we really need to think about that and the importance of that in these days. And he was elected a Fellow of the British Academy in 2010, Professor of Roman Studies, also at the University of Cambridge, and currently overseeing a project at Cambridge on the impact of the ancient city. I need to do a small amount of housekeeping, and then I will step back and let the real interesting speakers for this evening take over. So the event includes live captioning from stage text tonight, and it is being broadcast live on YouTube, and it will also be available to watch later on the BSR and the British Museum YouTube channels if you want to catch up with it again. There will be a Q&A session after the conversation between our two speakers. So we'd very much like to invite you to contribute questions for the speakers. You can write those into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and then they'll be conveyed to the speakers on your behalf. So it just leaves me to welcome our two speakers to the stage. I will mute myself and disappear from your screens and enjoy the conversation along with the rest of you. Thank you.
So, hi there, Mary.
Hello, Andrew.
We don't normally have to go online to meet each other. This is a fantastic occasion. I love the fact that the British Museum conveniently has a show on Nero at the very moment your latest book comes out. And I've got to say, here is Mary's latest book, and I have read it cover to cover, and I have really enjoyed it. It's a wonderful book. Now, there are loads of reasons for me enjoying this, not least that you and I have a lot in common. We have an affection for the 12 Caesars in common. And in fact, I brought an old friend along to join us, if you don't mind. Can we have him up there? Yes. So this particular Nero has been in my study for years and years and years, and I'm so pleased that he's now part of the British Museum's image. And as I read your book, but also as I listen to the British Museum stuff, I discover rather alarming things about this Nero of which I've been so fond for so long, that maybe this is not wholly genuine ancient Nero. What light can you cast on this chappy up here?
Well, do you mean materially, Andrew?
Well, okay, this is a plaster cast which I bought in Rome and sold by the Capitoline Museums. But I mean, one of the great problems always with ancient sculptures is what confidence can you have that this is a real ancient sculpture as opposed to some dodgy 18th century mock-up?
Well, I think that's really interesting, because you go to museums, and I'm not kind of casting my eye on the British Museum or any other museum here, but you go to museums and you find these guys confidently labelled, you know, Nero, circa 60 AD or something. And I think that, without wanting to kind of throw the whole baby out with the bathwater, there is something very perilous about all this. I mean, first of all, it's perilous to know who's who anyway. I mean, I think that one of the most interesting things about the early Roman emperors, from Augustus to Nero, is that actually they spent all their time trying to look as much like each other as possible. And we spend all our time trying to identify who's who, as if somehow we've got it completely wrong.
Yeah.
But more than that, I mean, you know, most ancient sculptures, let's remember, don't come named. They haven't got a label, and they all, for great periods of time, they look much of a muchness, intentionally, not by accident. But I think the other thing is that we're very reluctant to see sculpture as a work in progress. We think of it as made by an artist, we don't know their name, of someone, we may not know the someone's name, but somehow it kind of, we think of it as fully formed, being made and staying like it is. Well, I mean, I think what makes ancient sculpture, particularly, you know, I think portraits of emperors, even more interesting, is that from the very beginning, they've been added to, they've been reworked, they've been made to look like someone they weren't, you know, so that what you can see in the Nero exhibition is a sculpture of Nero's main successor, Vespasian, looking for all the world like somebody we would label Vespasian. It seems very likely, if you take a good look at him, that he was a Nero, and he was re-chiseled to make him look like the new guy once the old guy is off the throne. Yeah. And that's part of it, but it goes on and on and on. You know, most of the busts we see have been helped since their rediscovery. They've been given very posh sort of new busts to sit in. And you can be an academic purist.
Sort of stuff down here.
That's right. Stuff kind of, you know, alabaster and all this kind of stuff. They've been copied. They've been copied in such a way that we don't actually know. In some cases, we can't tell whether they're ancient or modern. So they're a wonderful kind of exciting, fuzzy mess of images of power, I think. All the better.
Do you remember my BSR colleague, Ilaria Bignamini, who sadly died 20 years ago? And she did fantastic research in the archives of the excavations. And she showed that again and again, when in the 18th century, they gave them a license and they excavated and they brought out some beautiful sculpture. Then 2 months later, an even better version miraculously appeared. And because the Vatican had the right to take the best version, they always took the second version, which of course was a fake.
Yes, no, that's
and the first version went off to the British Museum.
And that's, you know, in a similar vein, I often think, well, why are so many sculptures found at Hadrian's villa at Tivoli? Well, that's partly because a lot of sculptures were found at Hadrian's villa at Tivoli. It's also a fantastic provenance for anybody wanting to sell these things. So where did this come from, says the buyer? Oh, says the antiquarian seller, comes from Hadrian's villa at Tivoli. And so you get false provenances, you get fakes, you get partial fakes. And, you know, even the category of fake in these sculptures is quite hard, because, you know, a fake is only a fake if someone is trying to pass something off, something it isn't, which sometimes that's sure they are, but your plaster cast behind you is not a fake. You know, we're not sitting there thinking, is that a real ancient statue of Nero?
I'd be in big trouble if it was.
You would. We're thinking, there's a nice academic, Professor Wallace-Hadrill. He's got a nice version or a copy of you know, one of the sculptures he likes. And so there's a huge spectrum between outright fake, you know, here I am going to tell this damn idiot that this is a real sculpture from Hadrian's villa at Tivoli, from that, all through, well, something which has been helped a little, something which has got an ancient core, something which is, you know, avowedly in the 18th century, modern, but by the time it gets to the stately home in England, everybody's saying it's real.
Yeah, but one of the things I love about your book, Mary, is that you've actually made this guy richer for me. Richer, because it may sound as if you're just saying, look, you can't trust anything you see, they're all fakes, you can throw it all away. You're not saying that. You're saying this is a long living history. Yeah. This has been an icon in the past, but it's also been an icon in more recent times. Exactly. And its iconic status gets recycled endlessly. And I feel happy now to think that my bust isn't just an ancient thing, but an ancient thing with 18th century or whatever it is, layers added to it.
And, you know, I think, you know, if I'm quite honest, when I started this project, which was a very long time ago, I was a bit finger wagging. I wanted to say, do you know, they're not all ancient, you know, in a slightly sort of donnish fashion. As I worked on the book, I came to see they were much more interesting for being in this category of created and recreated images of a relatively narrow range, you know, of ancient rulers, and they were doing a job and worth recreating, not just through the Renaissance, but right up to now.
Yeah. Can we talk a bit about the issue of identification? How do you know? How do we know this is Nero, not someone else? And in a sense, you've just been pulling the rug from under our feet, saying, well, actually, all these guys were trying to look like each other, yes. Which makes it harder to identify them.
Oh, it does. It does.
For me, one of the great things is the role of coinage, which is you've got some slides, Mary. Could we use? You've got a glorious slide.
You got.
I don't think. Yeah, this guy, and you've got this portrait by Memling of a guy holding a coin of Nero.
Yes,
and that is so important, that portrait, in letting us know what Nero might look like. As it, excuse me, keeping on producing things, but when I was a kid, I used to collect a few Roman coins. I've got a Nero, you know, I've lived with this guy for a long time, and I've got a lot more confidence in him than in him.
Right, as everybody always has. And, you know, I think one of the kinds of works of art we've forgotten how to enthuse about is ancient coinage. And it is essentially the sole key. A few others at the sides, but basically the main key to identifying busts of Roman emperors. You get the coin of the Roman emperor, which does have a name on it, and you match it up with busts which don't have a name on it. And that's the basic method. And I think that people often imagine that somehow we have become better over the centuries and more sophisticated about how we identify, how we put a name to these ancient portraits. I don't think we've become better at all. I mean, we do exactly what was being done in the 18th century, and I suspect we're slightly more gullible than some of the people in the 18th century.
Well, Memling, if we can go back to your slide, Memling clearly really appreciated that as a bit of portraiture, didn't he?
Yeah, and I, again, look, I've been a classicist almost as long as you have, Andrew, and probably done.
Let's compare our ages.
A bit less on coins, but one of the things that struck me most forcefully when I was doing the work for this book was how important, immediate, and impressive the heads on Roman coins were to people. Now, I have to say that quite a lot of us, and I'm going to include myself here, we walk past a gallery of busts of Roman emperors, pretty quickly. They're not where people stop in the Louvre, say. Right?
Not nowadays, though you show very well that
they used to. They certainly don't stop in front of the coin cabinets, right?
Unless they're very short-sighted.
They're very short-sighted. But you see that people in, up to really the 19th century, when the death knell, I'm afraid, for Roman coins was when numismatics became a really technical university subject. And it then got, I'm afraid, don't quote me, boring, right? But up to that point, people saw that this was a named direct link to the Roman emperor who had put their head on the coin, and it was not mediated by boring old historians or whatever. If this was real, and people looked at coins and they said that they felt they were seeing the ancient world as it really was. And really, well, in part, if you go back to the 15th century, in part it's true that there were fewer marble busts discovered. But I think it's not only that. I think that our preoccupations has moved from coinage as our link to the ancient world, which, and that comes in Shakespeare, for heaven's sake, the idea of coins representing ancient power. And we have become, much more preoccupied with full-scale life-size busts. And, we are, one nice ancient historian of the study of the ancient world has said, we have become marmor-centric in our, we are focused on marble, whereas, until at least the 17th century, they were what he called numocentric, focused on coins. And, it would be very nice. And I think the Memling picture helps you do that. I think it's terribly important to recapture a world in which what you're going to display as your talisman of ancient power is a coin of Nero.
Yeah, but I think it's just fascinating, this portrait. One of the questions is, what are they admiring? Throughout your book, why this fascination with the Caesars, many of whom are very dodgy indeed, and we'll come on to that in a moment. But in the Memling portrait, he's not being held up as a wicked emperor, not a bad, but as a beautiful portrait.
And people have puzzled about this portrait. I mean, it's one of Memling's most famous, admired works. And yet the problem has always been, what the hell is this coin of Nero that he's displaying doing? And in fact, from x-rays of the portrait, we know that it was quite a late addition in Memling's plan. And nobody's ever got to the bottom of it. I mean, some people have thought that it was a nice Renaissance wordplay, that we don't know exactly who the guy is represented in the portrait. You know, maybe he was an Italian called Nerione, right? And so he's kind of playing with his name. Other people imagine, for example, that he might be the famous antiquarian Bembo, and that this might be a coin from his collection. Others moralize it and say, look, what's going on here is you're holding up a coin of a renowned Roman tyrant to show how complicated issues of beauty and morality really are, because this is a very beautiful, a very fine specimen of a coin, but we all know that Nero was a bastard.
I think that this is one of the really fascinating issues in all this. Can an image ever be divorced from the moral overtones that come with it? Yeah. There's a wonderful bit in the Greek philosopher Epictetus who says, you know, what do you do with a coin of Nero?
Yeah.
This is a wicked tyrant, but it's worth something. And there's all the time there's this ambiguity. And are we seeing an image that we should be admiring, or that we should really have some big questions about?
I think that's absolutely right. And I think it's very easy, particularly now the 12 Caesars, the first Caesars from Julius Caesar to Domitian, you know, are not quite the household names. They're still pretty, some of them still are, but they're not quite the household names that they were. We tend to look at these guys, and there are some women too, but the main lineup, I'm afraid, is resolutely male. We look at these guys and we just see sort of classical Roman emperor. We don't think, right, actually, to the viewers in the 16th century, 19th century, these figures are coming with baggage. You know, they're coming with a ideological, moral baggage. You know, they knew that there was not, with the exception of Vespasian, Nero's basic successor, there was not a single Roman emperor about whom there was no rumor at all that their death had been unnatural, you know, whether it's forced to suicide, murdered, you know, eating the poison mushrooms or whatever. So these are images of, very familiar images of power for all kinds of people who are representing them in medieval manuscripts right up to modern cartoons. But for previous generations, at least for some people, I mean, not for everybody, they came with their stories attached.
Yeah,
and part of the point of the book is to say, look, if you put the stories back in, they become a lot more interesting.
Yeah. But this is the paradox of the fascination of the 12 Caesars, isn't it? There you've got Suetonius's biographies of the 12 Caesars, and there are bad bits in every single biography.
Yeah.
And we're fascinated, and you know, for centuries, people have been fascinated. But there's a peculiar fascination with the badness. Yeah. You know, Nero, everyone knows about Nero, and everyone knows he fiddled while Rome burned.
Yes.
What is it? What is this fascination with the bad emperor?
That's what I think is interesting, and I think that's
you've got another slide, I think.
Oh yeah, shall we have? Yeah.
There we are.
There's Gordon Brown as Nero fiddling while Rome burned. There's Giulio Romano doing it in a slightly more austere, well, no, not austere, but less funny way. I think that that's where it really hits home to us, because, you know, I think you can see, you know, even in our current statue wars, right? You see this idea that the people you see around you, whether it's in public spaces or sculptures in churches or statues, you know, in stately homes and or in museums. Sometimes museums act as a kind of repository for those we don't want anywhere else. There is a sense that when people put up public statuary, what they're doing is putting up statues of people they admire. You know, that statues are celebrations. And some of them sure are. You know, I don't imagine that your Nero behind you. I mean, I think he's one example, actually, of a statue of Nero that's had quite a lot of work done, really, subsequently. But I don't think whoever did the original of that thought, I am going to now hack out a statue of a real tyrant. Right? You know, it wasn't. So, but I think there's a much more complicated set of relationships that happen next, when people decide to copy them or to redisplay them or to make their own new versions of them. And, you know, it's very, one has to kind of try to get one's head round. I think it's hard, actually, that bigwigs, aristocrats, dukes and monarchs throughout Europe were decorating their palazzi with images of people they knew to be dreadful, right? And so they're using these sculptures and these portraits. I suspect, it's very hard to pin down, I suspect they're using them in a way which is much more kind of interlocutory. They're wondering about what power is, you know, what is good power. And I think that it's going to sound very very unlike me, but I think that over the course of writing this book, or I remain a convinced anti-monarchist, but I've become more sympathetic to the individuals who were the kings. Because I think one of the things that it's hardest to be in any period of history is a sole ruler, you know, because you know you're fallible, and yet you know you have to pretend not to be. And one of the things that these lineups of flawed Roman emperors is doing for you is helping you bring that to the surface.
So it's not just monarchs, is it? You've just shown us Gordon Brown.
Yes.
And the politician suffers from this too. Yes. And of course, it's very familiar that the media tear strips off our politicians, and just as well that they do. But if we believe everything we read in the media, we end up believing that Nero fiddled while Rome burnt. And I'm sure some of our audience want to know whether you think, did Nero really play, well, his lyre more like fiddle? And I know what your answer is going to be, because you introduce yourself brilliantly in your book as a classicist, historian, teacher, skeptic, an occasional killjoy. So is Mary the killjoy going to tell us that Nero never fiddled?
Well, I think the first thing we've got to say is that even the phrase Nero fiddling while Rome burned has got wildly kind of represented. So I think there are a lot of people in the world who think that Nero fiddling while Rome burned did not mean that. It meant kind of sort of playing with his marbles and kind of not keeping his fingers to himself. You know, he was a fiddler.
Surely he was playing a musical instrument. It wasn't a violin. It was something more like a harp.
You might say that.
What Suetonius says is he played a composition of his own on the sack of Troy.
Yes,
which of course was burned.
I'm going to call you out for being too much of an academic here, because for most people now, to fiddle does not mean to play any kind of musical instrument at all. Okay. It means not to be able to keep your hands to yourself. It's kind of doing this. And most people think that Nero just didn't concentrate properly while Rome was burning. And I've had several arguments on Twitter, so I know this to be true, which tries to, in which I've tried to put that point to people who are absolutely convinced that musical instruments had nothing to do with it. Look, I think the thing is with with most of these stories that you read in Roman biographers, ancient Roman history, the literal truth, I think, is not really what's at stake here, because they didn't know and we don't know. And yeah, I am a killjoy a bit, because I kind of say, no, you don't know, that's true. But I think many of these stories that kind of hang around the necks of Roman emperors, many of them are kind of true at a different level. They're symbolically true. And so, as you said, actually, Nero is not, according to Suetonius, Nero was not just playing his lyre and therefore being utterly unconcerned with the fire of Rome. We know, in fact, we know that he was pretty concerned to have a rescue package for the people who had been unhoused and whatever. But when you say, he's singing about the fall of Troy, you suddenly see that you're dealing here with an autocrat who is kind of so removed from this world that he can cast that kind of present disaster in terms of the greatest mythical story that Greece or Rome ever had. It's showing, and it's like saying, oh, what an artist dies in me. Is it possible to be a fan of ancient mythology if you're Nero? Is it possible to be a responsible emperor and someone who loves Greek culture?
Yeah.
So raising those questions to you. Yeah. Mostly those stories are about trying to make you think, I think.
But Nero loves drama. And in a sense, what this story is saying is my story of me and Rome is as dramatic as the Iliad. It's as dramatic as the fall of Troy. And in a funny way, that's why we buy it, isn't it? Well, we love the drama.
Yeah. Well, we also love the kind of the bits of megalomania that story of drama entails. And I think we do tend to operate when we look back now to the two best known ancient cultures, which is classical Athens and Rome of the emperors. And Rome of the emperors has always done a different job for us than classical Athens. What you don't get very many paintings of classical Athens. You don't get many busts of Pericles being reworked and it's all
get the Parthenon.
You get the Parthenon, but that's all.
That's another of your books.
Thank you for the plug. But Rome offers us something, and still offers us something larger than life. So that if you want to think about power, if you want to think about tyranny, you want to think about emperors, how rulers get it wrong. In as vivid technicolor as you possibly can. You think ancient Rome. We could give some perfectly good examples from ancient Athens. We don't. Rome stands for us for kind of a magnifying glass on power, corruption, attempts at virtue, and actually still does. I mean, I think one of the things that my book tends to leave out, it glances at it, but it now does that in film as well as writing, actually, and probably most in film. And, you know, one of the blockbusters of the last quarter of a century was Gladiator, the film Gladiator, which is precisely taking you into that way that Rome and corrupt Roman emperors rub your noses in what it is to abuse power.
Yeah, yeah. Well, okay. What do we make of Nero and his mum? His treatment of Agrippina. I mean, if you want tyranny at its very, very worst, murdering your own mother's got to be pretty high on the sheet, hasn't it?
Yeah.
I think you've got another slide.
Yeah, let's have a look at this.
Right. Yeah.
Now, I mean, I think
gory murder.
Health warning. I'm not here. What Nero did to his mother. If you want the truth, I mean, dream on. I'm afraid, but
look away.
But it became absolutely established in ancient writing and then in the reworking of it, that Nero, first of all, had an affair with his own mother, and then when she got inconvenient, had her killed. And there are a whole series of paintings. I could probably name you about 25 on display in galleries, you know, in this country probably, which enacts the moment when Nero sees the body of Mum.
Yeah. And
that was quite an important issue in ancient writing. Nero is, in one account, Suetonius, I think, supposed to have, once she had been killed, got out of the way because she was becoming very inconvenient. He's supposed to have inspected the body with a wine glass in hand. But it becomes one of those sort of lenses onto what is, you know, can we start to imagine what the domestic life of an autocrat is? And does it have anything to tell us about our own domesticity, actually? And how far can we imagine that scene? How far, you know, is that beyond imagining? And there are plenty, the picture we saw just now is relatively kind of relatively austere, and quite a lot of people.
There are others that are worse, aren't there?
Yeah, but there, you know, you probably need a caption on that painting for anybody to say, "All right, you know, that is Nero looking at the body of his mum, with whom he had an affair and whom he has killed." But let's look at the next one. This is in the Prado, and it's I think one of the spookiest images of the abuse of Roman power, because there you've got a very luscious Agrippina kind of lying on an animal skin, displaying herself as erotic object, and you don't know whether the guys around are peering at her as if at some kind of specimen of, you know, scientific specimen, or whether we're kind of close to necrophilia. There is something deeply, deeply disconcerting about that image in terms of its kind of pseudo-dispassionate quality, but wondering about how do we picture the guy who murders his mum, you know, and who, by the way, is the emperor of the Roman world. Other artists have kind of have a different time doing it. Let's see the next one.
I mean, there's a special fascination with he looks at her womb, doesn't he?
Well, yeah, and you know,
and it's the womb that has given birth to him, which he is now having to
And these kind of things pick up from Suetonius saying that when Nero finally sends the hit squad round to his unfortunate mother, having tried various ruses in order to get rid of her before, she says, strike my belly, strike, you strike, you are going to kill the woman who gave birth to the emperor, and you're going to kill her in the place she gave birth from. So as well as, it's about, in some ways, the kind of the worst perils of dynastic succession. I mean, it's about incest, it's about prurience, it's about, corruption and wickedness at the very center of the ruling family, but it's also about succession. That in the end, every emperor kills their mom.
Yeah. There's a nice question that's just come in from the audience asking, if Agrippina's memoirs had survived, do you think they'd have been a good read? What do you think she would have said about her teenage son?
Yeah, well, I think the trouble with this is that if you when you start to separate the real Agrippina from the fictional Agrippina, I mean, I would really like the fictional memoirs of the fictional Agrippina. I've always had a suspicion, when you're asked by people what work of literature would you want to survive from the ancient world that hasn't, it was very tempting to say the memoirs of Agrippina. I'm
sure Robert Harris could forge them.
I'm sure Robert Harris would do brilliantly. I also kind of feel that probably, if we're realistic, they would be a bit of a disappointment. I think these larger than life imperial women, which have come down to us not only through ancient writers, but through the kind of paintings that we've just been looking at, I think they're very much a product of the male imagination, so one side of me says, yeah, bring on the memoirs of Agrippina. That will blow apart Nero. Another part of me thinks it might be terribly boring, that actually Agrippina, let's leave aside the incest and all that, she actually had a very dull life. She was in the back room, she wasn't allowed to do anything, and she spent most of her time weaving and sewing, and and so did Livia, forget Sean Phillips, and we're still, I'm afraid, we're still a bit the victims of that kind of way of imaging those women who were close to the men in power, aren't we? I mean, I don't know what Carrie Johnson's role in the wallpaper saga was, but she probably spends more time changing nappies than running the country from behind the scenes. And I think it's probably true of all these women. I've
got another great audience question for you. Which in fact takes me on to another area I want to explore. The audience question is, can you throw light on the current rage for revisionist views of bad emperors like Nero? I myself feel very strongly about it. Why do people want Caligula to be okay after all? As if there weren't horrible tyrants in the past, as there certainly are in the present.
I think you have to be bifocal here. And I think that you don't get very far in understanding the kind of images that I'm mostly talking about. Why did people in the 19th century decide to represent these things, and what did it mean? You don't get very far by, me becoming yet again the finger-wagging Don and saying, terribly sorry, Nero wasn't as bad as that. And so I think that we're never going to get rid of the myth of Nero, and we wouldn't want to, and there'd be an awful lot that we wouldn't understand, including the early history of Christianity, if we decided that we were just going to throw that away. I find revisionism a bit troubling, because it seems to fall into the trap that it claims to avoid. That emperors either come good or bad, right? Mm-hmm. And so you've got some that appear to come from the ancient world good, and I'm going to say they're bad, and we've got some of these monsters, and I'm going to say, no, it isn't quite as simple and straightforward as that. And I have been, I admit I've been guilty of this. I mean, I think that for me, and it's the thing I'm hoping to do in the next book that I'm going to write, and I think it was underlying the Nero exhibition at the BM, is underlying, although it's been treated a bit as a revisionist history. I think the really interesting question is not, was Caligula a pussycat all along? The real question is why and how and for what reasons did Caligula go down in history as a monster, or did Nero go down in history? And some of those might be that they were, I mean, I'm not saying that I don't think, we wouldn't like to have dinner with any of these guys, they're awful. But their images are hugely overdetermined by, well, for amongst other things, by what happens next. If you look at the stories of emperors who are, fairly well agreed to be assassinated, to have been assassinated.
Yeah.
The usual story, both told by the ancients and by us, is that they were assassinated because they were monsters. Now, I think it is equally possible, and we could never tell the difference here, it is equally possible that they became known as monsters because they were assassinated, and the new regime, everything depends on who your successor is, and what the new regime that follows Caligula or Nero or whatever, their reputation is absolutely dependent on showing that that bastard was rightly got rid of.
Yeah, but here, of course, Mary, you're being the ancient historian, aren't you? So your focus is on them. But you're not just the ancient historian, and your book shows it spectacularly. You're interested in how we actually pervert the ancient pictures. It's as if, succeeding generations have made a beeline for the very worst bits in the 12 Caesars. The nice bits are too boring. What about the Roman orgy?
Yeah, well, should we?
Can we talk about Vitellius and the orgy? You've got one of my favourite pictures. I think it's your last slide.
Yeah, should we go to slide 10? It would be great. The last slide. This is.
What are we saying? I mean, I've actually been to the Musée d'Orsay, and it's absolutely vast.
This is absolutely
an entire wall.
This is.
It's covered with heaving bodies.
Yes, it's
it appears to be saying, "Oh, how wicked."
Yes.
But at the same time, it's saying, "Whoa,
that's a party I might like to be at." Yeah. I mean, I think this is a really interesting painting. It was painted in 1847, just before the 1848 revolution. And it is by Thomas Couture, and it is called The Romans of the Decadence. And it's still slightly famous, but nothing like the extraordinary fame that it had for when it was first painted, and then throughout the rest of the 19th century. There was some evangelical guy in America who said that a copy of this painting should be in every high school in the United States.
Which is an extraordinary suggestion, isn't it? Because it's showing people copulating.
Yes. And, it is absolutely the kind of, the conundrum about, in order to know how bad vice is, you actually have to look at it. Andrew's now going to, I shall plough on without my chairman.
No, I am back. I've killed the phone call. I think it's probably someone ringing up to protest about me talking about copulation. But there you go.
What I think is very interesting about this painting was it was hugely hyped. It was hyped by the artist, and and people came along and they said, look, we think he might be objecting to the disparities of wealth in 1840s France, just like in ancient Rome. And somebody then said, but the amount of canvas that he's used would actually clothe a peasant family very happily. So there's a problem here. But everybody could see that it was representing a Roman orgy, and it quickly became basically sort of known affectionately as Couture's orgy painting.
Yeah, but I mean, one of the problems is we speak of the Roman orgy as if we knew that the Romans did that sort of thing.
Again, it's back to this bifocality. 99% of the Romans, and maybe even close to 100, would not have known what lavish dining was like. Although for us, and the way that we have incorporated images of Rome, they are, they're larger than life in terms of power, they're larger than life in terms of eating, they're larger than life in terms of sex. They represent our values pushed on. However, I think there's an interesting trick in Couture's orgy that I think was recognized at the time, but people, I think, now don't often spot, because the bottom right-hand corner of that slide, I've given you a small picture of what was then a famous statue in Venice of the Roman Emperor Vitellius. And Vitellius used to be pretty much a household word, honestly, and as well known as Nero.
But interestingly, he was famous for being an absolute pig and eating too much, not for having orgies in the sexual sense.
That is true.
And the painting, it doesn't show the Romans being greedy. It shows them being corrupt, whatever, degenerate. That's the word.
I think what is very interesting, though, is that if you look at that painting, there are all kinds of little vignettes in it. But one of those vignettes is clearly the face of one of the people in the painting is taken from this bust of Vitellius. And I have to say now, it isn't really a bust of Vitellius at all. It is certainly later than Vitellius, who was one of Nero's successors. Never mind, it was believed to be, and I call them emperors in inverted commas. It was believed to be Vitellius. And one of the other things that has struck me in writing the book is that image, that face of this wrongly supposed statue of this gluttonous, unsuccessful emperor from the year 69, who ruled only for a few months, that face has found its way into hundreds of modern paintings. And here, and I think it's always doing an interesting job. And here, and I've blown it up for you, so I hope you can see here that face is given to a bloke who, is coming on morning, and he is now so knackered after the revelry of the night before that he is nodding off. And he's nodding off despite the fact that he's got a pretty well naked odalisque, right in front of his nose, right? This is, so here we've got a figure based on the Emperor Vitellius, so sated with the kind of orgy that no doubt Vitellius would never have experienced, that he doesn't even see that there's a naked woman in front of him. Now, I think one of the things you can say here is, well, that's quite interesting, isn't it? I mean, Couture has just used this then famous statue, it's not now so famous, to provide the face for his for one of his revelers. At the time when it was first exhibited in the Paris Salon, everybody spotted Vitellius. They said, you can't mistake Vitellius in that. You then say, well, does this make a difference to this painting? And one of the problems about it, and the interpretative problems, is, partly as you're suggesting, Andrew, so what do we, what is this about then? Are we kind of rather slightly jealous of this, or are we utterly disapproving? And what's the moral? And it's called the decadence of the Romans, but when is the decadence of the Romans? What is
the Romans are our alibi, isn't it? It's a picture of our worst vices, which we've projected on the Romans, and we're ticking the Romans off. But
we should be ticking ourselves.
Alibi.
That's we should be ticking ourselves.
Mary.
But also, I think there's a sting in the tail here.
Yeah.
Because what I think it's partly reminding you of, you say, okay, so we got Vitellius here. You say, what happened to Vitellius? Well, he was in civil war very brutally murdered. He was kind of decapitated,
tiny little pieces,
and thrown into the River Tiber. It was absolutely dreadful. One of the worst bits of sadism of Roman assassination stories. And so I think that gives you a way of reading this painting, because if you want to say, this is saying that no good will come of this. If the painter is saying, the decadence of the Romans has got a nasty end, this, to them, mid-19th century viewers, that very, very distinctive face of Vitellius is making that true, because one of those banqueters, okay, he might be completely kind of trying to sleep it off now after a heavy night at the party, but we know he's going to end up in little pieces in the Tiber.
A very good moral to end on. Mary, I think we're going to segue seamlessly into Q&A session, and I've got a couple of really relevant questions sitting in front of me here, and one is the way Nero has been portrayed through dramas such as I, Claudius and Quo Vadis, and I, Claudius is so fantastic in this story, both have similar representations. Do you feel that films like these have solidified our present image of these emperors?
Yes, I think they have. I think that, well, as I say in the book, largely about Julius Caesar, but it could be about any of the biggies, the big names. Yeah. Even the most kind of academic archaeologist has met Julius Caesar in Asterix, long before he or she has met Julius Caesar in a bust or in, histories or whatever. These emperors, or the big ones, for better or worse, and I kind of think better actually, are kind of hardwired into our cultural imagination in ways that has solidified a particular vision. Now, I think what's interesting about that is that doesn't make them boring. I wonder if we could just put on the screen the 6th slide, because I think that brings that out very nicely about Nero. Yeah, I mean, because we've been talking about Nero, the murder of the mother, the incestuous lover of mother, the monster, the killer of the Christians, and Christianity has had quite a lot to do with Nero's subsequent reputation. But at the edges, those very solid images still allow you to play around. And this is one of my favorite images of Nero, late 19th century image by J.W. Waterhouse. And here, there's Nero just after he's had mum killed. And he's obviously going through terrible remorse, Maybe. Don't be so cynical. But you look at him and you suddenly see another side of Nero, and it is actually a side of Nero that the British Museum show brings out quite nicely. We know that image. That is the moody teenager. I mean, Nero, which is what he is. Nero is the monster. He is the man who's ordered the execution of mum. But he's barely 20, and he's now lying on his bed like all our kids did. And we suddenly see, oh, blimey, part of the tragedy of Nero is not his the fact that he's a tyrant on the throne. It's the fact that he's a teenager on the throne. This is the Roman Empire under the grip of a kid of 17.
That's a very nice take on it. Going back to the audience question of I Claudius and Quo Vadis, I think one reason for reading your book is that it shows what these films come out of, that there's been a sort of an accretive process, starting with the ancient sources, but constantly over the centuries, recycling these myths, and every time they get a bit bigger. And I love the way that in I Claudius, you've got a sequence that starts with Suetonius, which Robert Graves read with great attention. And then Robert Graves adds his own little bits. And then the BBC series reads Robert Graves, and do they add this?
Yes.
The story always grows in the telling.
Yes, it does.
It's like we're addicted to the wickedness. We need more and more wickedness. We can't get them bad enough.
Yeah, I think you're being a bit slightly unfair there. I mean, I have to say that I'm one of the people who much prefers the television series of I Claudius to the novels, and I was very. I have to say, I read the novels after I'd seen the television series, and I was shocked to discover that the best lines were put in by the screenwriter of the television series, not by Robert Graves. But I think I mean, there is a kind of the pleasure in observing wickedness. But I think there's also that kind of the sense of the dilemmas and the difficulties of imperial power, or being the emperor or the king, kind of, always bursting out, which gives it something more than simply a kind of sense of, isn't that disgusting? And you can go to I Claudius, and of course you see there, is Augustus a goodie or a baddie? Can you ever be a good emperor? Can you ever be a good emperor's wife? So I think the best of these novels are not the sort of, bunk-busting cheap novels about Messalina, the wife of Claudius, who only sleeps with people, apparently. They're the ones that say, well, can we ever imagine what it's like to rule the world? And of course, the Roman Empire is a kind of safe space for us, because it's very distant. It has got all those accretions. It isn't us, but it enables us to think about some of our dilemmas, whether they're about modern dictators or modern prime ministers.
It's fascinating, isn't it, how hard it is to get into the head of an emperor. Someone's just asked, what more unconventional, surprising sources do we have that shed light on Nero's image? But if you want to get into the head of an emperor, of course, the best source is Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, which show you an emperor agonizing with a really difficult job.
Yeah, they show you an emperor with a really difficult job. They also show you an emperor talking the most appalling cliches. It is better to reflect carefully before taking a major decision. I have never ever understood. I get into terrible trouble here with people who admire Stoicism. I've never understood why people like the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, because what he does is give you kind of homespun platitudes, but from the person, from the emperor's mouth. But, I think in terms of surprising things about Nero, I mean, most of the surprises come, I think, from reading the hostile sources that we have a bit against the grain.
Yep.
That, when you discover at the end of Suetonius's life of Nero, which has not been wholly opposed to Nero, but very largely, you discover that people went on decorating his grave with flowers in the years after his death. And when you discover that in the East, much like kind of the return of Elvis Presley, there were false Neros emerged, claiming that Nero had never killed himself, and was come back to claim his throne. You get a glimpse there that there's another tradition here.
But an interesting thing about Suetonius is he doesn't give you just a monochrome picture. No. He's interested in there being different sides to the story. Yes. So he actually brings it out. It's like, you may be amazed after everything I've just been saying about Nero, but actually, he wants us to know that there was a popularity of Nero. Yeah. So he wants us to know that it's actually very complicated.
Yeah. And Suetonius is a very interesting case, and Andrew knows a lot more about him than I do, having written, one of the best plug, because Suetonius writes the series of biographies that form our vision of the series of 12 emperors. Now, actually, paintings or statues of the 12 emperors are an entirely modern invention. No, so far as we know, no.
When you say modern, you mean Renaissance.
Renaissance, yes, I mean Renaissance and later. They're not ancient. There may have been, somebody in the ancient world might have tried to do a 12 emperors of Suetonius, but if they did, we know nothing about it. But what's very interesting about Suetonius is that for a long time he worked in the Roman imperial palace. So actually, although people often write him off as the gossip, he was the guy who knew what the kind of corridors of power were like. And we ought to take his gossip, I think, more seriously than we do. Yeah. And in fact, some of these painters, one of the reasons I like them is they do take that gossip seriously. They wonder what it was like to be there, when Domitian was killing flies with his pen or whatever, So
if we can transport ourselves back to the imperial palace, surely we would expect to find that an emperor too had a portrait gallery. These are my predecessors. But here's the question. Did they display all of their predecessors? Did they display the bad ones? So maybe we could talk a bit about the whole problem of demolishing statues, deleting people's memory. Here's the audience question. Should we take down ancient statues if we follow the same line of argument as taking down modern statues?
I mean, I think that the modern statue wars would do well to think a bit harder about the ancient world, because I think it gives you a different perspective. I've already said, that they're a reminder to us that statues have got a different job to do, not only to celebrate. But I think also you see Romans being more imaginative than we are in how they treat this. Now, it's certain some ended up in the river. Some were pulled down and ended up in the river. And there's been not a time, I would venture to say, in the history of humanity in which some statues of people we didn't like were not pulled down. But
the interesting thing is that the town council of the day did not prosecute the people who just chucked the statue in the river. On the contrary, they said that proves how odious he was.
Well, the town council might have been leading the posse of people who were shoving it
in antiquity. Yes, yeah. We're far too protective today.
We are, we kind of have a very conservative with a small c view about these statues, but also we have a very sort of binary view. Either the statue is in the river or we are putting it on a pedestal and honouring it, and you've got to decide. Well, I think that the way, as I mentioned before, Romans might get their chisels out and say, I don't like Nero anymore. I'm going to turn this guy with a few careful chisel strokes into a Vespasian. Yeah. It's also pretty certain, they could certainly do this with gods, that sometimes they just relabel them. Who knows? We're living in, distant Britain, right? We haven't the foggiest clue, apart from some very tiny coin images, what these emperors look like. So it doesn't matter. We can just put a new caption underneath. We can change. These are images and portraits of men, usually men, but not always. Portraits of men in power are there for us to reappropriate, reuse, alter in a much wider and more sophisticated way than just either kind of nodding in pious homage or pulling them down.
I think for me, you get that sort of nuance in Suetonius's lives. Should we pull down a statue of Winston Churchill? For heaven's sake. Winston Churchill was not perfect. There's good and there's bad. There are negative things about him. There are positive things about him. Suetonius is terribly good at telling us all these emperors had good sides and they all had bad sides. Even so, people pulled down their statues.
And yet, you can read Suetonius like that. And you can read other ancient sources. But of course, what happens is they gradually, and this is like the previous question was asking, there is a sort of central solidity to their image, which is then added to and sometimes questioned by later writers. And that's where I think that when we talked about rehabilitation a bit ago, and I think it's just not got the right message, really, because we can't go back. We've got too much baggage, actually, to go back and say, Domitian, you might think that he was a nasty piece of work, but he was an efficient administrator. That is both obviously true.
Right.
It's obviously true, but very uninteresting. And I think one of the things my book wants to do is to try to think, how can we find these myths interesting and productive and creative without committing ourselves either to believing them hook, line and sinker, or the reverse, which is saying, well, that's not possibly true. How can you see why Roman emperors remain good to think with and what job they're doing for us? Because, you can go through cartoons of Nero and right up to the present day You can, every time a politician doesn't appear to have his mind or her mind on the job, what does the cartoonist do? Put a laurel wreath on their head, some flames in the background, and a lyre or guitar in their hand. And most people still recognize that.
Yeah. Can we explore myth and reality a bit more? Here's a lovely question, which in some ways is very simple, but is actually really difficult. What do you recommend for history students to try to understand the differences between myth and reality in ancient history?
Oh, blimey.
That's a killer.
Well,
is there a difference, Mary, in your worlds between myth and reality?
I think it would be dangerous to say there was no difference between myth and reality. On the other hand, it's very hard to find a clear way of separating them. And this is going to sound like a terrible self-advert, and I don't mean it to, but it was partly writing this book which made me see that I wanted to go back a bit more fundamentally to the ancient world. I mean, most of the book that I've just written, not all, but the majority is about modern, from the Renaissance on, representations. And it actually pushed me back to think, what were these guys like? It did push me back to say, how would you answer if somebody says, so what was Nero really like then? How would you start to answer that question in a way that was truthful and not disappointing? Right? Now, I think there are ways to do that, and you can look at the places these guys lived, you can read the sources in a different way, etc., etc. If you were to say now, okay, so what would I go out and buy that had some sense of the complexity of the image and the myth versus the reality? I think there's a good book in that little Oxford OUP's very short introduction series by one of our colleagues, Christopher Kelly, on the Roman Empire, which, actually does see the complexity of that kind of representation. And it's not so much it's falsehood versus fact, but it's that it sees that these figures operate and are used and are part of our cultural heritage in a way that goes from the most nitty-gritty bits of factoid kind of history right the way through to the fantasies of movies. And they're, in some ways, they're separate, but in some ways they're playing off against one another, and they're forming. What was my introduction to Julius Caesar? I think it probably wasn't Asterix. I think it was Carry On Cleo. And infamy, they've all got it in for me. Right? Now, the austere historian in me says, "Oh, goodness me. But actually, we're still working with those images. I still see Kenneth Williams saying infamy.
So that raises, sorry, this is a me question, not an audience question. It raises the question of the relationship between the historian, the professional, you and me, university people, and the novelist or the screenwriter or whatever. Are we talking about different realities? Are we talking about different ways? Do we learn from each other? I think we do.
Oh, we do. And we're talking about, different forms of reality which are so inextricably connected that we can't pull them apart. We can't pull them apart from the very beginning of the historical tradition. Tacitus puts into the mouth, when he's giving you the history of these early emperors, he's perhaps a more important source than Suetonius in some ways, but he puts into the mouth of these characters speeches that he couldn't possibly have known they've said. There is, fiction is embedded in Roman history writing, outright fiction from the very beginning. And I think that we have to find a way of enjoying, embracing, and facing up to that. And the thing I think about most of all when I kind of answer a question like that is Robert Harris's work on, his novels about Cicero, because I did my PhD thesis on Cicero. And I didn't bring Cicero to life in any way whatsoever. In fact, I put him further into his grave, I fear. And, I feel extremely grateful in some ways to Harris, who has actually made Cicero again someone we're interested in. When I was doing my PhD thesis and people say, what did you work on? And I said Cicero, people thought that was extraordinarily boring. And indeed, in a way, it was. Now, I'm not saying that Harris has got it right, but I'm saying that Harris has given us some new tools with which we can think about why we think about Cicero as we do.
I couldn't agree more. I'm a fan of Robert Harris's Cicero too. And I remember when he told me he was going to do 3 books on Cicero, I said, "You're a very brave man," because people hate Cicero. Right. And he showed that you can actually get into Cicero's mind and Cicero's world in a way that you and I aren't quite allowed to do.
I think you can't. I think it's always come. He's got the license of fiction.
Yes.
But it enables you to ask different what-if kind of questions.
Yep.
The academic history discourages you from posing. It actually, it's not that it isn't very good at posing. It actually tells you not to pose the kind of questions that Harris poses. And, in the end, I'm still telling my students, that not to pose all those questions, but I also want them to see what that has opened up for them.
Yeah. And we can get our students to read these books and then say, okay, with your equipment as a fledgling scholar, how do you want to critique it? Not spot the errors, but what do you think he's missed? What's he caught well?
And many years ago now, something like 30 years ago, I did a course in Cambridge on the image of the Roman emperor. And one of the most successful ways into that was, it was at a very big time in our own royal family. It was when Charles and Di's marriage was breaking down and Camilla was on the sidelines and there was the squidgy gate tapes and whatever. But what you saw was that some of the ways in which we talked about these people whose lives we knew very little of were very closely analogous to both how the ancient talks about Roman emperors and how we talk about Roman emperors. Their sex life is always peculiar, right? Would be one message.
Mary, I have one final audience question for you, and then I'm going to hand over. And this is the sort of question you like. Will Mary be doing any book signings of her new book?
In loads of places. And I'm certainly going to be in Oxford and in Cheltenham and in Edinburgh and St Andrews. So if you put Mary Beard book signing into Google, you'll probably come up with somewhere near you. If you don't, you can find my email on the Cambridge Classics website and you can write and ask.
And true fans will go to all of them. I see the face of the director of the British School. I think she's going to wind us up.
Thank you so much. Thank you both. That was just fascinating, stimulating, exciting, slightly disturbing in all the best possible ways. Really enjoyable. I'm sure I speak on behalf of our large virtual international audience in saying what a pleasure it was to listen to you in conversation. I won't be taking many of the leadership lessons that I've been hearing about this evening into my new role here at the BSR, but what I will be doing is creeping out under cover of darkness with a chisel in order to refashion some of the portrait busts of previous directors in my own image. So this is a lesson that I feel I can turn to good use.
You will notice that there isn't one of me.
Yes,
because I feared such a fate.
This can be rectified. So thank you both so much. Thank you to the British Museum for hosting us, albeit virtually this evening. To tell you too that the next Nero-related event with the British Museum is on October 8th on Nero and Populism. So the title of that is Emperor of the People, The Rise of Populism. And if you're interested in tuning in for that, I think that the link for signing up and registering will be shared with you in the chat. Likewise, there are many exciting events coming up in the British School at Rome programme, and we are also streaming our events online, as well as, when possible, giving them sometimes in person. And our next event, Rome-related event, is on the 6th of October, and that is Thea Ravasi talking about elite housing and the transformation of Rome. So really welcome to sign up for both of those excellent events. And it just remains for me to thank both Mary and Andrew again so much for such a fabulous evening. And next time we will do it in person. Thank you very much.
Magari.
Thank you. Yes, certainly. Not Magari, certainly.